Is mythology the language of the soul? It might be, but first, we need to define what a soul is, what a myth is, and what language is. Let's start with a soul. The biblical definition of a soul is given to us in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7.
Then Yahweh Elohim formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living soul.
The important point in this passage regarding myth and what constitutes a soul is that man is a dualistic creature composed of a physical half and a spiritual half. According to the Bible, humans have two natures, material and non-material, rational and irrational, earth and heaven. These two natures combine to create the magic that is the whole experience of life. To completely understand who we are, it is essential to know that man is two attempting to understand himself as one. So, what is a myth? A myth is any fictional or non-fictional account that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people. The most important and distinguishing characteristic of all myths is that they are all written embedded with two forms of communication. The first method a myth uses to communicate its message is literary. A well-written myth uses the literary method to relate an easy-to-understand tale told through the words in the myth. These are the stories we learned in childhood, such as Little Red Riding Hood and The Myth of the Minotaur. These simple stories told to children are what I call the front story of the myth. The second method of communication found in all myths is symbolic. The symbolic story in a myth uses symbolic language to tell a completely different story from the front story. This symbolic story found in all well-written myths is the backstory and is created through the words, dialogue, characters, and environment of the myth. The front story, combined with the backstory, creates the myth, and the combination of these two forms of communication is what separates a myth from an ordinary tale. All myths are written in this dualistic and formulaic style of linguistic communication, which I have dubbed mythical writing or mythical literature. What is language? Language is any form of communication that imparts a concept from the sender to the receiver. Since we know that man is comprised of two diametrically opposed natures, it makes sense that he would be able to understand two diametrically opposed forms of language. The main difference between a literary form of communication and symbolism is that the literary form of language uses words and sentences to create a concept that forms in the mind of the receiver as they hear or read the words. The symbols used in symbolic language already represent concepts, and the combination of the symbols creates a completely conceptual story without the need for logical interpretation. Symbolism and the concepts portrayed by symbolic entities are not required to be interpreted by man's logical left brain language center. Because symbols are already concepts, they can be used to bypass the filter of our logical left brain language center and flow directly to the unconscious brain. Symbols enter the mind intact, which leaves little room for faulty interpretations. In summary, words are used to create concepts, and symbols are already concepts. The two methods of communication found in all myths, literary and symbolic, are designed to educate both halves of man's dualistic nature. Man's two natures are diametrically opposed to each other, and therefore require two diametrically opposed forms of communications to fully educate us. The front story in a myth is the simplistic tale we read when we read a myth without symbolic interpretation. Usually, the front story in a myth comes across as slightly disjointed in its descriptions of the characters and situations we find them in. Wolves cannot swallow grandmothers whole, as we read in the myth of Little Red Riding Hood. The Minotaur, a bull-headed man in the myth of the Minotaur, was not a real creature, but it symbolically represents the struggle every man must eventually face and overcome. if he is ever to regain life while he is alive. These oddities of construction in the front story of all myths are due to the backstory written symbolically alongside the simple front story. The literal front story in a myth typically tells a tale based in the real physical world, and the symbolic backstory almost always deals with man's spiritual consciousness and the journey of the human soul. Another consistent characteristic of well-written myths is that they contain clues within the myth to help the reader decode the symbols unique to that myth. The symbols in myths usually have archetypical foundations similar to our dreams. The serpent is an excellent example of this repeating symbolism, as he appears in almost all the world's creation myths. These clues in myths can be straightforward and open, but sometimes they are hidden deep within the symbolism of the myth and can be very tricky to decrypt. For example, in the book of Revelation, the author uses the symbols of the lampstand and the stars and tells us their meaning. Being told what the symbols mean by the author is as straightforward as you will ever find in a myth. The same author then connects a known symbol in Revelation to another symbol in Revelation whose meaning we do not know. Now we know what they both mean. He then relates the same symbol to another symbol in the Old Testament whose meaning we may not have known before. Now we know what all three symbols mean. As myths go, Revelation is excellent at helping us unlock the message of the myth. For us to relate to any human, including ourselves, we must strive to understand both halves of the whole man. As a dualistic creature, the whole of our being is defined as both physical and spiritual. One is not greater or lesser than the other. They are both necessary and critical to the experience of life. They are two halves of one coin. Man is two, and therefore requires a dualistic medium of communications to reach both halves of his being. That is what myths do. They communicate to both sides of the man's being. Through this dualistic and balanced approach to influencing our psyches, myths become potent tools of instruction. The physical half of the myth is written with letters, words, and sentences in the language of humans. This linearity of communication appeals to our linear, logical left brain. The left brain is where our language center resides and where we live when we live in our heads as the egoic man. We like the front story, and it appeals to us because we humans are a storytelling people. The spiritual half of the myth is written in symbolic language. The term symbolic language covers everything used to tell the symbolic story written within the myth. It includes symbols, grammar, and poetic structure. The symbols used in any myth will be unique to that myth, just as the symbols in our dreams are unique to us and the dream in which they appear. Symbols within myths can share universal themes with other myths and even our dreams. However, how the symbols manifest depends on the myth's intended audience or the dreamer's unique psyche. Consciousness is spirit, and almost all symbolic tales in humanity's myths relate to man's spiritual journey. We know through science that man codes and decodes physical language through his left brain. The left brain is where we find the language center, and it is in the language center of the human brain where man processes the written and spoken word. All of our communications in the physical world, whether we are talking to each other or just ourselves, are done through the language center in the left brain. But what about the other half of man's being? How do we communicate with our consciousness, mind, or our heart? Since our physical nature is the complete opposite of our spiritual nature, it is probably a good bet that we don't use words when communicating with our mind. It is a good bet, because we don't use words. When we communicate with our mind, we use symbols and symbolic language. The language of our dualistic souls is, therefore, dualistic. One uses words to speak to our physical brain, and one uses symbols to communicate with our symbolic mind. This is the reason myths are written literally and symbolically. In a sense, myths work similarly to hypnosis. Hypnosis can plant suggestions in the unconscious brain by circumventing the executive functions of the conscious brain through distractions. The silly front story of a myth is there to distract us like a hypnotist's swinging watch. It is like the magician's right hand in a magic show, which we can see. The right hand and the swinging watch are there to distract us. The symbolic backstory is like the magician's left hand, which we miss because we are distracted. The symbols are used to bypass the executive functions of the distracted conscious brain so they may enter our unconscious brain. In a sense, when we listen to or read a myth, we are subliminally programmed by the written and spoken words that contain the symbolism. The real lesson of any myth is the symbolic story, the backstory, hidden in the background by the distraction of the literal front story. The front story is there for the physical brain to understand. The symbolic story is there for our spirit or consciousness to understand. The universal story found in almost all of humanity's myths is the hero's journey, made famous by Joseph Campbell. In his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Campbell constructed the hero's journey outline after reading hundreds of myths from every myth-writing culture around the globe. The vast majority of these myths only tell the story from the beginning of the adventure until the hero overcomes the world. The adventure is certainly the most exciting part, but it is only one half of the complete story. The real story is what I call the original myth. The original myth is the complete story of the journey of the human soul. It consists of 3 acts and covers the man's entire life, not just the exciting adventure at the end. Act 1 is where man is born into perfection as an infant and briefly enjoys life as a perfected human in childhood. Act 2 covers man's descent into the world of ego, the heart of the earth. This is where the man suffers the first death, the death of spirit. In Act 3, man reawakens as Christ with the full knowledge of God. This becomes the second death, the death of ego. The full myth of the journey of man's soul is covered in the myth of Job, found in our Bible. Campbell's depiction of the hero's journey begins in the middle of Act 2 of the original myth, the hero's lowest descent into the heart of the earth. That is where most of the world's myths begin. They begin at the start of man's climb back to glory. But these myths seldom tell us why the hero has to adventure in the first place. Once again, it is easier to know where we are going when we also know where we have been. If the human soul is accurately described in Genesis chapter 2, then man is indeed a dualistic creation, requiring a dualistic form of communication in order to reach his whole being. Only mythology and the mythical writing style can actually do this. Speaking to the entire soul of man is speaking the language of the soul. This is why mythology and the mythical writing style is the authentic language of the soul.